Before I get into my less than pleasant feelings about the musical, let's talk about some positives. The core idea of this show is sound. I love the idea of looking at what happens to the hero after they're not a hero anymore, especially someone like Harry from these musicals who has built his entire personality around it. Had this musical only focused on that, I think this could have been a really good musical, but it didn't, which I'll get into later. The music in this show, with the exception of one song, which you can probably guess what it is really solid. Tessa mentioned when I first started talking about this musical that it has one of their favorite soundtracks, and honestly, I can't blame them. Considering the songs only take up about 18% of the overall runtime of the musical, a lot of effort clearly went into them. Shout out to the string of absolute bangers that is This School Is Mine, I Was, Sidekick, and Everything Ends, which all fall right next to each other on the soundtrack. I did not include this in the script, but I do want to point out that a lot of these songs were written by Clark Backstresser and Pierce Sievers. A.J. Holmes obviously wrote Gilderoy, but other than that, it was mostly these two. Finally, this show had a very big cast, and each actor did a very good job with what they were given, even if they were only in one scene. This show was a stage reading, which means that everybody had a script in their hands that they were reading off of. With that being said, I have to give props to Joey Richter and Joe Walker, who not only had bigger roles, with Joey playing Ron and Joe playing Tom Riddle, there was also pretty large gaps in the musical where they didn't have their scripts with them. Special mention should also be given to Darren Criss. Darren is an extremely busy individual who took time out of his schedule to do this show because he loves the people involved so much, but it does mean that he didn't have a lot of time to look at the script before he performed it, which means that he spent the entire musical reading from the script. Understandable. However, despite this, he still not only sounds really good singing all of these songs that he didn't know that well, but he also does a very good job of still acting through the lines and reacting accordingly, which is not easy to do when you're reading from a script. So major props to Darren for doing it so successfully. Also, Evanna Lynch. For those who may not know, Evanna Lynch played Luna Lovegood in the movies and is also apparently a fan of StarKid, so she was able to come in and reprise her role of Luna Lovegood while somehow playing an even stranger version of the character. It is a shame that we can't see more of Ariel Goldman's portrayal of the character. We see her very briefly at the end of Harry Potter's sequel, but it is Evanna Lynch, so I can't complain too much. However, even with these things that I do enjoy about the musical, if you were to ask me if I think this is a good musical, my answer would be no. My main issue with this musical can be summed up in one sentence. This musical is almost 3.5 hours long. Even as someone who really loves musicals, 3.5 hours is too long for a musical. I think it can be justified, barely, if there are no superfluous scenes. However, this show has a number of those. I think ultimately the problem stems from the fact that the people who created this musical weren't necessarily trying to create a good musical, they were trying to create a farewell show for Darren. Darren leaving StarKid was kind of abrupt. Obviously people leave StarKid for a variety of reasons, like when they moved to LA and a number of them stayed behind in Chicago. Darren was originally cast in Starship, but then he got cast in Glee, and so he wasn't able to do that, and then that kind of became his life for a while, so they never really got to say goodbye. So that's what this show is, and I can forgive a lot for that. However, it just means that what we end up with is something that's not that great a musical. So many themes seem to exist purely to give people who want to be a part of this something to do. For example, this musical has Nearly Headless Nick's Death Day Party. This seems to exist just so that Joe Moses can have another part to play because he played Snape in the original and Snape is dead at this point. From the perspective of the narrative, this just shows that Harry isn't liked by his peers anymore, something that has already been done multiple times in a more streamlined fashion. And I've already talked about the Aragog scene, but that's another prime example. Again, I can respect the reasoning behind this being that everybody wants to have a chance to say bye to Darren. But ultimately what it leaves us with is a musical that is trying to do too much and just ends up feeling bloated and too long. Also, one of the things that I appreciate about StarKid is its universal appeal. For most of the other musicals, if you happen to stumble across them on YouTube with no knowledge of StarKid or the original source material if it's a parody, you can still enjoy it. This musical is not that. This seems to exist purely for fans of StarKid and fans of Harry Potter. This leads us to the matter of placing this on my scale, which is a little tricky. It's definitely above Me and My Dick, because while I don't think this is a good musical, I think Me and My Dick is a bad musical, and there is a distinction. And it's definitely below Harry Potter Musical, because I think Harry Potter Musical does a better job of telling the story. which ultimately just leaves us the question of where it fits with Harry Potter's sequel. I think I would leave it tied with Harry Potter's sequel. While I think sequel had a better written story and not feeling as bloated, even though it's technically longer, still being bloated and too long, don't get me wrong, just not as bad, Senior Year doesn't have a transphobic character, so tied. So that is Harry Potter Senior Year. Next week I will start the next musical, Twisted, The Untold Story of a Royal Vizier. See you then.